Hi, Jenny. Thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed. We really appreciate your help and your time. And for the audience, Jenny is our expert for this interview. She's only a grade 11 student, but she's already part of Team Canada, representing the country to compete internationally in the subject of geography. Would you like to introduce yourself further, Jenny?
Hey everyone, my name is Jenny. Yes, like I mentioned, I am a grade 11, but I have like a profound passion for geography. I think it actually started fairly recently, maybe like 2 or 3 years ago during COVID. I just found myself drawn to maps in general, learning about different countries and politics, government systems, just everything about the world. I think I'm generally curious about, and I'm just happy to be here.
Cool. So now we'll start with our first question. Have you ever been to Singapore?
Yes, I actually have been to Singapore roughly, I would say 4 years ago.
Mhm,
And Singapore has quite drastically changed since then.
mhm.
But yeah, yes, I have.
What are your favorite places and what do you suggest for people who plan to visit Singapore?
There are definitely some must hit spots. If you don't know, there's quite a big hawker culture in Singapore. Those are
Mhm.
just like food stands in food courts, and it's just a casual way of dining with friends. And there's this one place called Hawker Chan. It actually had a Michelin star when I went, but it lost it a couple years back. But when I went, it was just like surreal to be eating at a Michelin star restaurant where one meal, which was like a soy sauce chicken with rice,
Mhm.
costed roughly $2.
Oh my God. Eating a Michelin star with just $2. That's a steal right there in Singapore. I'm also surprised too when I researched about Singapore and I came across this restaurant that has Michelin star, like you say, Hawker Chan. I believe it's in Chinatown, right?
It is in Chinatown, yes.
Mhm. And yep, great. So next question is, how do you travel around Singapore? How do you get around?
So when I went there, I found that Singapore was a very walkable city. And when I
Mhm.
looked into it further, it's actually ranked as like the second most walkable city in the world. And I would definitely have to agree with that. I would say all the spots you need to hit in Singapore are within a 5 kilometer radius.
Really?
Yeah, so you have a place, let me just recall what it's called. I think it's like an island. It's mostly like a beach area of Singapore.
Marina Bay Island, right?
Yeah, so
Or
that's
Sen
more
no,
like
actually Sentosa Island.
Sentosa is what I'm talking about.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep, yep.
Sentosa is like the bottom, the southernmost point of
Mhm.
Singapore, roughly. And you have Chinatown, and that entire metro area is just roughly 10K in diameter. So,
Mhm.
really, everything you need to visit and every place you need to hit in Singapore is within walkable distance. But if you really want to travel to the more western parts of Singapore or the airport, which is in the east, I would recommend the metro in Singapore. It's called the MRT, Mass Rapid Transit. And you can actually get like a tourist pass, which means you can ride the metro or the bus or the light rail for very affordable rates for a couple of days. And this is just perfect for tourists like me and you.
Yep, definitely.
Okay, so the next question is, what are some prominent cultural practices in Singapore?
Yeah, Singapore is still a fairly young country. The Republic of Singapore gained its independence from Malaysia in 1965, which is just about 60 years ago. That's why I'd consider Singapore to be like a melting pot of different cultures, specifically East, Southeast, and South Asian. And roughly 75% of Singapore is ethnically Chinese, which means Chinese New Year is a huge deal in Singapore. It's like a public holiday.
Mhm.
There are red scrolls posted on doorways everywhere with auspicious sayings, and they're known as Chun Lian. And you might have seen the dragon dance as well, which is performed to scare off the evil spirits and usher good luck and
Mhm.
prosperity into the community. And something quite common and popular amongst the kids, and certainly for me, is red envelopes filled with money, given by the elders as a symbol of good fortune. But Chinese New Year is not the only major holiday in Singapore. There's also quite a sizable Tamil community in Singapore, which is why Diwali is a huge deal. And we know it as Diwali here in Vancouver because of the Hindu population here in Canada, but there's a sizable Tamil population in Singapore. And so it's actually referred to as Deepavali. And that's the South Indian reference to Diwali, which is Northern Indian. And Diwali, as we know it, is like the festival of lights. There's lights lit everywhere, and the streets, roads, the floor is covered in candles. And this is lit to attract good luck, ward off evil spirits, and to symbolize that inner light protects against spiritual darkness. And something else very common in Diwali is that rice, specifically colored rice, is sprinkled on the ground in geometric shapes, dots or lines to form patterns. And the food scene during Diwali is incredible. You might have heard of samosas. They're like food pockets. There's like potatoes, onions, spices, and beans or peas in them, and it's delicious. One of my favorites is barfi, which is like a milk powder, sugar kind of like cube, and it's creamy in texture, and there's cardamom and ghee in it, which is like a Indian clarified butter. So very delicious and one of the most important holidays in Singapore.
And most of the food during that festival, they're all traditional Indian food, right?
Yes, that's right.
Interesting.
Well, say is your favorite? Is your favorite holiday or?
Well, I personally do celebrate Chinese New Year, so that would have to be my favorite. And in Singapore, obviously due to its very sizable Chinese majority, it's widely celebrated there. Even if you're not Chinese, it's just rooted in Singapore so deeply.
If all the cultures in different countries come together in Singapore, is there an official language in Singapore?
Yes, there's actually 4 official languages, I
Oh, okay.
believe. So Malaysian,
Mm-hmm.
because Malaysia is right next door, and Singapore did used to be part of Malaysia, and also English because the British once ruled Singapore and Malaysia at one point in history. Tamil because of its sizable Tamil community, and Mandarin Chinese because of also the Chinese majority in Singapore.
I see.
Okay. Next question is, how did Singapore come to be this country with, so many different Asian cultures, like Chinese, Malaysian, and Indian? Like, how did it become this, country with so many different cultures?
Yeah, this is a question that I used to ask myself when I was younger. And honestly, it's time for like a history breakdown because this goes quite far back. So in 1819, there's a guy called Stanford Raffles, and he was the British governor. And he basically designated this little island known as Singapore as like a natural trading port to the rest of the world. And in 1826, Singapore became part of the Straits Settlements, which was then controlled by British India. And now in 1867, it was under full British control. But only a couple thousand on the island were initially residents there, and just thousands and hundreds of thousands more people immigrated to work in pepper plantations. And there was a rapidly growing rubber industry in the 1890s. So Singapore became like a global hub for rubber sorting and exports. And the first group, I would say, to actually immigrate to Singapore are the Tamilians, which trace their origins to southern India and northern Sri Lanka because Tamil Nadu is the southernmost state of India. And they came to Singapore decades and decades before Singapore even gained its independence from Malaysia in 1965. They came as tradespersons, civil servants to the British administration, and manual laborers as well. And they came as, and they still live as descendants among Singapore. And a large portion of them were taken by the British to work as coolies, which is another word for laborers, in the plantations of Malaysia and the dockyards of Singapore. And they arrived in Malaysia and Singapore through the very expansive but illegal slave trade, which was also prevalent in China during another time period. But generally, more Tamilians were recruited because Tamil Nadu is like a coastal state and it is closest in proximity to Singapore compared to the rest of India. So that kind of explains the Tamil ethnicity of Singapore. As for China, traveling of Chinese overseas was actually banned before the Opium War. So any form of coolie trade was conducted through Macau, which was not Chinese controlled, but actually under Portuguese rule at the time. So any form of mass migration of Chinese laborers actually came after the Treaty of Nanking was signed in 1842. And that meant that coolie trade was officially legal and it reached a very high peak. So Chinese history is rooted deeply in Singapore back all the way into the 1860s, 1840s. But the most recent, I would say the most recent mass migration was from Malaysia to Singapore, which began in like the 1960s, 1970s, after Singapore gained its independence. And this is because in the early 1970s, the government focused on developing its electronics industry and services sector, and most Malaysian workers were concentrated in those areas. But by the late 1990s, the number of unskilled Malaysian workers decreased, and foreign laborers from other Southeast states, such as Indonesia and Thailand, were hired to kind of offset the labor shortage instead. And that's why there's just so many different cultures in Singapore, but Malaysian, Chinese, and Tamil are the primary ones.
Yeah, that's actually, I think that's what makes Singapore special as well, because it's just like a hub mix with different cultures. Instead of going to each country to explore more about its culture, now tourists could just go to Singapore and explore multiple different countries' heritage in one same place.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, my mom was being loud there. Okay, one last question is, how does Singapore's geographical feature help develop its economy? So like how does Singapore being where it is help with its economy?
Yeah, so this is a great question that I think is very much geographically related and something that I'm quite familiar with. If you do know, there's something called the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's where certain areas of the world are most prone to earthquakes and volcano eruptions. And there's neighboring countries in Southeast Asia very close to Singapore, that being the Philippines and Indonesia. Fun fact, there's like 3 earthquakes happening in Indonesia every single day. So Indonesia and Philippines have suffered massive natural disaster crises, and it takes billions and billions of dollars to rebound. But Singapore is not located on a dangerous part of the Ring of Fire. It's seismically safe and it's on a stable part of the Eurasian plate, which means it's not prone to natural disasters, which are very costly to an economy, which takes tremendous toll on a country for sure. So that's why it can actually focus on developing its international trade and export instead of focusing on rebounding and recovering every couple of years. And something else though is just like the location. I think of it as like the gateway to Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia. There are a lot of Chinese and Malaysian and also Indonesian and Bengali migrants to Canada and the US, and we often like to return home for the holidays. So there are direct flights from Singapore, primarily to and from Canada and Bangladesh and a bunch of different cities. So Singapore is like, I think of it as like the layover hub, and it has like a fantastic airport too. If you've ever been, there's something called like the Jewel. It's like kind of like a plaza, and then there's a garden in the inside, and there's like a sky glass dome thing, and there's a waterfall coming down. It's like a fantastic airport. But yeah, trade is a big part of Singapore's finances as well. Just next door is the South China Sea, and China is Singapore's main trading partner. And as well, Indonesia is just a Java Sea away. That's why Singapore is like the world's busiest cargo. And 40% of trading passes in the Malacca Straits are guaranteed to be Singapore. So Malacca Strait is the area between like Indonesia and Malaysia, and it opens into the Bay of Bengal, which is in the India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka area. So it just opens to the rest of the world that way. And 40% of cargoes passing through are Singaporean, which is why it's a huge industry. And layovers as well. I mean, aviation comprises of 3% of Singapore's GDP, which is quite sizable.
Wow. Just a word, wow. That was such a thorough explanation. Like you cover all aspects, all the fields that help develop Singapore economy. I personally, I've been to the Changi Airport before, and I have to say that it's such a modern and high-tech airport as well, because you take sky trains, right, to get from this terminal to another one. And also it's wide as well. I was lost, actually. I was lost during my flight back to Vietnam during spring break, and I had to find my way. Took me a bit of time to get to the right gate, but yeah. So I guess that's it for our interview today. Thank you so much for providing us such deep insight into Singapore country. Thanks to you, we learned more about country, more than just a country, but also about its culture, its history, its background, the evolution that helped shape Singapore that we know today. Um, I wish you all the best and enjoy your evening. Thank you so much for joining with us in this interview.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Tyne, and nice to meet you, Sunny. I hope this is helpful towards your class, towards your podcast, and honestly, it's just great having to share my experience and getting the chance to do that.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.